Welcome to CSS Breakdown Book by Book, Season 05, Episode 07, where we delve into Andrew Haywood's political theory, an introduction to explore fundamental questions. Does law liberate or oppress, and can order truly emerge from below?
And welcome to the deep dive. Today we're plunging into a really fascinating section of Andrew Haywood's political theory and introduction. Specifically, we're looking at his chapter on law, order, and justice.
A really rich chapter.
Absolutely. Our mission is basically to pull out the most crucial insights, as we grapple with some pretty profound questions in political thought.
Big questions.
Yeah, like, is law inherently a tool for liberation, or is it actually about oppression? Can societies really find order from the ground up, or does it always have to be, imposed from above?
And we'll also get into the complicated links between law, morality, and justice.
Right, and even touch on that tricky subject of when, if ever, it might be okay to break the law.
What is law? Beyond simple rules. Okay, so to kick us off, let's try and unpack something we use all the time, but maybe don't think about too deeply. Law. I mean, we follow rules everywhere at work, in sports clubs.
Even family rules, yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So what makes law different? What sets it apart from, say, the rules of a chess club or a church? What gives it that special weight?
Well, that's a great starting point. Political theorists have specific ways of defining law. It's not just any rule.
Okay.
So first, it's generally made by government, applies right across society, and it reflects the will of the state. It kind of overrides other norms.
So club rules don't count if they clash with state law.
Precisely. Your club rules won't save you if you break the actual law of the land.
Got it. What else?
Second, it's compulsory. You don't really get a choice. It's backed by the state's power to coerce, punishment.
Read the force behind it.
Then third, law is public. It has to be published, recognized, gone through some kind of formal process.
So no secret laws.
Ideally, no. It ensures predictability. You shouldn't be arbitrarily arrested or punished. And finally, it's usually seen as binding. There's an implication of a moral duty to obey, even if you disagree with a specific law.
So it's kind of the foundation for, well, civilized life.
That's how it's often framed, yeah. The bedrock, the rule of law, a shield or a cloak.
Okay, so if law is this powerful foundational thing, how do we make sure it's actually serving us?
Yeah.
Not just dominating us.
Well, that leads us straight into this really key idea, the rule of law.
Right. Sounds impressive. A government of laws, not of men.
Exactly. It sounds noble.
But what does it actually mean in practice? And I guess, does it always protect us?
Well, it's definitely a core principle, especially in liberal democracies. The basic idea is that the law itself should rule.
The law rules.
Yeah, it sets up a predictable framework that applies equally to everyone, from, regular citizens right up to government officials.
Okay.
Thinkers like John Locke saw law not really as a restriction, more like the opposite, a guarantee of liberty, protecting those fundamental rights, life, liberty, property.
Keeping us from the chaos of a state of nature.
Exactly. Protecting us from that barbarism, as he put it.
Mm-hmm.
And looking at how it works in practice, you see different approaches, right? The U.S. has its strong constitution, checks and balances, due process. Judges have a lot of power there.
Right.
Whereas the UK historically emphasized things like no punishment except for breaking a specific law, everyone being subject to the same law, but then you have parliamentary sovereignty.
Which means Parliament can technically make any law it wants.
In principle, yes. Which kind of challenges the idea that the law always rules over the lawmakers themselves. It's a tension.
So it's a powerful ideal, this rule of law, a shield against arbitrary power, maybe.
That's the ideal.
But the sources, Haywood points out, they also raise some pretty big criticisms, don't they?
Oh, absolutely. It's not universally accepted as purely protective.
Like the Marxist view. That law isn't neutral at all.
Exactly. Marxists tend to argue that law primarily protects property rights and shores up the capitalist system. It's part of that whole superstructure built on economic power, essentially masking class domination.
Okay, and feminists.
Feminists often point to inherent male biases baked into the legal system historically and sometimes still today. And multicultural theorists argue law often just reflects the values of the dominant culture.
Ignoring or disadvantaging minority groups.
Precisely. So the big question becomes, is the rule of law really this equal shield for everyone? Or can it sometimes act more like a cloak, hiding existing power structures and inequalities?
That's a really challenging thought.
It is. It suggests the ideal is one thing, but the reality, shaped by human biases and power dynamics, well, that can be quite another. It forces you to ask, whose rule are we really talking about? Law and morality, a tangled web.
Okay, that leads us perfectly into another huge question. Should law enforce morality? Or are they totally separate things? Is one objective, the other just subjective feeling?
Ugh, the age-old debate. This is where we get into natural law versus positive law.
Right, natural law. That goes
Well,
way back.
way back, Plato, Aristotle. The idea that human laws should align with some higher moral principles, a kind of universal sense of right and wrong that guides us towards being, well, virtuous.
Like a moral compass for law.
Sort of. Thomas Aquinas, for instance, saw human laws as ideally reflecting God-given natural reason. And you see echoes of this today. Think about the Nuremberg trials after World War II.
Prosecuting Nazis for things that were legal under their own regime.
Exactly. They appealed to a higher moral law, what we might now call universal human rights, arguing those actions were wrong regardless of Nazi law.
Okay, so that's natural law. What about positive law?
Positive law kind of pushes back against that. It emerged from wanting to see law more as a social fact, separate from morality.
Just what is the law, not what it should be.
Pretty much. Legal positivists like John Austin basically said law is law because it's set down and enforced by a sovereign, a political superior, and because people obey it. Full stop.
Doesn't matter if it's a good or bad law.
Not for the definition of what law is, according to strict positivism. H.L.A. Hart later refined this, talking about primary rules, the ones telling you what to do or not do, and secondary rules, which govern how laws are made and changed and enforced.
Okay, so there's a real tension there.
A huge tension. Natural law gets criticized as being too philosophical, maybe too vague. Hopelessly philosophical is a phrase sometimes used.
Right.
But positive law, if you take it too far, risks completely separating law from any moral anchor. It could potentially justify incredibly oppressive laws, just as long as they're properly enacted and enforced.
Oh, so this isn't just theory. It really affects how we think about what law should do.
Absolutely. And it connects to questions of individual liberty. If law and morality are distinct, how much should the law interfere in our lives?
Like John Stuart Mill.
Exactly. Mill's On Liberty and the famous harm principle,
Which says,
basically that the only justification for exercising power over someone against their will is to prevent harm to others.
harm to others, not to themselves.
That's the crucial bit. Mill draws a line between self-regarding actions where the individual is sovereign and other-regarding actions.
So things like laws against suicide or forcing people to wear seatbelts, Mill might question those.
If their only justification is preventing self-harm, yes, he'd argue that's paternalistic. If you want to ride your bike without a helmet on an empty road, Mill would likely say that's your choice, your risk to take.
Seems logical, but also difficult.
It is difficult, because what counts as harm? Mill mostly meant physical harm, but what about psychological harm, moral harm, or even just causing deep offense?
Right.
Patrick Devlin, for example, argued against Mill on this. He was worried about what he saw as growing permissiveness.
Right.
Devlin argued society has a kind of shared public morality, a common sense of right and wrong, and the law has a right, even a duty, to uphold that to protect the social fabric.
So law should enforce morality, in Devlin's view.
Yes, to maintain social cohesion. This often resonates with conservative thinking, upholding traditional morality, family values, against perceived threats like permissiveness, or even multiculturalism, eroding shared values.
But then the counter-argument has to be, in diverse societies like ours, is there really one single public morality?
Exactly. Is there a consensus? Or does trying to enforce one just mean the law ends up enforcing the prejudices of the majority against minorities or dissenting views?
A really tricky balance.
Imposed or spontaneous? Okay, this leads us nicely into our second big question for today, order. Does it have to be imposed from the top down, or can it actually emerge naturally from below?
The fear of disorder is a constant theme in political thought.
Hobbes certainly comes to mind, his description of life without order.
Solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short.
Yeah, it's great.
So how do different thinkers see order?
Well, you get very different pictures. On one side, you have those often traditional conservatives who link order firmly with discipline, regulation, authority.
Order from above, definitely. This often comes from a pretty pessimistic view of human nature. Maybe like Hobbes, seeing people as fundamentally self-seeking, maybe inherently flawed or corrupt.
So disorder, crime, vandalism comes from individual moral failing.
That's the view, which naturally leads to a law and order approach. Strong police, tough penalties, deterring bad behavior.
Right.
Thinkers like Edmund Burke also saw society as this delicate, almost living organic thing, held together by tradition, institutions, culture, and law plays a key role in upholding that, even in teaching morality.
And psychologically, people want security.
Deep down, yes. People often crave stability, the familiar. Order provides that. But this emphasis on tradition and shared culture can have tricky implications, especially for diverse, multicultural societies, sometimes leading to resistance against things like unchecked immigration, fearing it disrupts that established order.
Okay, so that's the imposed from above view. What's the alternative?
The complete opposite, really, coming often from socialists and particularly anarchists.
They see it differently.
Totally. They argue disorder isn't fundamentally rooted in flawed individuals. It's rooted in the structure of society itself.
Like Rousseau saying man is born free but is everywhere in chains.
Exactly that sentiment. From this perspective, crime, disorder, their symptoms, bred by social injustice, poverty, inequality, maybe even capitalism itself, encouraging greed and selfishness.
So, fix society, fix disorder.
That's the logic. And anarchists like Peter Kropotkin or Leo Tolstoy take it even further. They see law itself as a primary cause of disorder.
Law causes disorder. How?
They see it as a form of organized violence, inherently oppressive, maintained only by force, by coercion. Their solution: get rid of laws altogether.
Really? Just abolish law?
Yeah. Trust in people's natural capacity for cooperation, for harmony, believing humans are fundamentally rational or sociable or both, and will manage just fine without the state imposing rules.
Wow. So are we inherently good or bad? Selfish or cooperative? It seems like your answer to that shapes your entire view on law and order.
It really does. That fundamental assumption about human nature underpins everything: the purpose of punishment, justice, or utility.
So if we accept that some form of order needs maintaining, and sometimes laws get broken, that brings us to punishment. What's it actually for, beyond just, making someone suffer for doing wrong?
Yeah, what's the justification?
Yeah.
Political theory usually identifies three main rationales, and they're based on very different ideas.
Okay, what are they?
First, there's retribution. This is probably the oldest idea. Basically just deserts, an eye for an eye.
Vengeance, almost.
It has roots in vengeance, yes. But it's framed more as a moral judgment. Punishment draws a line between right and wrong, good and evil. It has to be proportional to the crime.
So this could justify the death penalty for murder, for instance.
For supporters of retribution, yes, it's seen as the only proportionate response. It also expresses society's moral outrage, supposedly strengthening shared values.
What are the problems with it?
Well, it's maybe less suited to modern, secular, diverse societies where there isn't always a single shared morality. And it tends to ignore the social factors that might contribute to crime, focusing only on individual blame.
Okay, so retribution is one. What's next?
Second, deterrence. This is less about the past crime, more about the future. Preventing crime from happening again.
Oh.
By using punishment to scare people off. Jeremy Bentham was big on this. General prevention was the main goal. You punish one person to deter others through fear. It's a kind of social engineering.
Does it matter what the punishment is?
Not necessarily in terms of proportionality. Deterrence could, in theory, justify very harsh, even cruel punishments if they effectively set an example, which raises ethical questions about using one person for the benefit of others.
Right, potentially victimizing the offender.
And it also assumes criminals are always rational calculators, weighing the pros and cons, which often isn't true, especially for impulsive crimes, crimes of passion.
Okay. Retribution, deterrence. What's the third?
Third is rehabilitation. This shifts the focus quite dramatically. It tends to see the criminal not as inherently evil, but as someone needing help, education, reform. Responsibility shifts more towards society.
Why?
Because this view often links crime to social problems: poverty, unemployment, poor education, bad housing. It's attractive to liberals and socialists who believe crime is often bred by these conditions.
So what does rehabilitation look like in practice?
Things like non-custodial sentences, community service, maybe prison programs focused on therapy, skills training, building self-esteem. Restorative justice approaches fit here too.
What are the criticisms of this one?
Critics worry it can become a kind of personal engineering, maybe absolving individuals too much of personal moral responsibility. It can blur the lines between explaining someone's actions and excusing them.
It's fascinating how different these are. They really stem from totally different views of people and society.
Fundamentally different, yes. And trying to base a justice system on just one, or even trying to mix them coherently, is incredibly difficult. They often pull in opposite directions.
Yeah, I can see that. A system focused only on deterrence might be really harsh, while one only on rehabilitation might seem too soft to many people.
Exactly. Finding a balance that feels just, acknowledges responsibility, considers social factors, and maintains public confidence. That's the perpetual challenge. Justice in practice, process versus content.
Which brings us right to justice itself. When we talk about legal justice, what do we actually mean? Is it about the process being fair or the outcome, the law itself being fair?
That's a crucial distinction. Legal justice often focuses on how the law distributes penalties, or maybe compensation. And we can break it down into two main types.
Okay.
First, there's procedural justice. This is all about how decisions get made, how the rules are applied. Is the process fair?
Like in a race, everyone starts at the same time, runs the same distance.
Exactly. The officials are impartial. In law, this means things like formal equality.
Yeah.
The law applies the same, regardless of gender, race, religion, etc. It means having impartial judges, maybe a jury system, rights to appeal.
Like those miscarriage of justice cases, the Guildford 4, Birmingham 6 appeals were vital there.
Absolutely. It also includes things like the presumption of innocence. You're innocent until proven guilty, and the right to silence. Think of the Miranda rights in the U.S., strict procedural rules.
Okay, so that's the process. What's the other type?
That's substantive justice.
Mm-hmm.
This looks beyond the process to the content of the laws themselves. Are the rules themselves fair? Are they moral?
So even if a discriminatory law is applied perfectly fairly to everyone it targets,
It's still substantively unjust. Think about laws that historically barred women from voting or prevented certain minorities from owning property. Applying those laws fairly didn't make them just laws. Their content was inherently unfair.
right, that makes sense.
The big challenge, though, is that agreeing on substantive justice is much harder because it depends on fundamental moral beliefs, and people disagree profoundly on those. Take the death penalty again. Whether you think it's substantively just depends entirely on whether you lean towards retribution or deterrence or rehabilitation. They give completely different answers.
So how do we decide what's substantively just?
Well, Patrick Devlin, whom we mentioned earlier, suggested linking it to consensus morality. What would the average person, this phrase was the man on the Clapham omnibus, find acceptable?
The reasonable person on the street test?
Kind of, leading to a distinction between laws that reflect a broad consensus and those that are more controversial, non-consensus laws.
But again, who decides what that consensus is, especially today?
That's the problem. The idea of judges who aren't elected trying to determine society's consensus morality, sometimes called judicial activism, is really controversial. Can they truly know? And in diverse societies, is there even a single consensus defined?
It seems like relying on consensus could just mean imposing majority views.
That's the danger, yes. When law and justice collide, justifying disobedience.
Okay, so all this discussion about law, morality, justice, it leads to one final, really interesting, maybe even explosive idea. If law and justice don't always line up, is it ever okay to break the law?
A critical question.
Yeah.
And we need to be clear, we're not talking about ordinary crime here, people breaking the law for personal gain.
No, this is different.
We're talking about principled law breaking, what's usually called civil disobedience.
Okay. What defines that?
It's typically understood as a public act, not hidden. It's nonviolent. And crucially, it's done conscientiously, often with a willingness to accept the legal penalties, precisely to highlight an injustice and bring about change.
Can you give some examples?
Classic examples include Henry David Thoreau refusing to pay taxes, supporting slavery and war, Mahatma Gandhi's campaigns in India, his concept of satyagraha or truth force, and of course Martin Luther King Jr. and the civil rights movement in the U.S.
So the motive is key. It's about a bigger principle, not self-interest.
Exactly. The justification usually rests on making that distinction between what's legal and what's just, asserting that sometimes individual conscience or a higher moral law must take precedence.
When might it be seen as justified?
Well, proponents argue it's justified when protesting laws that are seen as fundamentally wicked or unjust in themselves, like laws enforcing segregation, or maybe draft laws during an unjust war. Or perhaps when religious duty conflicts with legal requirements, like Sikhs refusing motorcycle helmets.
What about protesting wider injustices?
Yes, it's also argued as legitimate when legal channels for change are blocked or simply don't exist. Think about protesting authoritarian regimes like Nazi Germany, or the suffragettes fighting for the vote when they couldn't participate legally.
And sometimes, maybe, the urgency of the cause, like environmental or anti-nuclear protests.
That's often cited too, yeah. The argument being that normal democratic processes are too slow or inadequate to address an urgent threat.
Now, it feels like since the 1960s, maybe, civil disobedience has become, well, more common, even seen by some as a legitimate tactic for pressure groups.
It has become more widespread, yes. Things like sit-ins, boycotts.
Hmm.
They can be effective ways to gain publicity and sympathy. It's sometimes framed almost as a sort of unconventional but still legitimate constitutional act.
But there must be downsides, right? Dangers.
Oh, absolutely. Critics raise serious concerns. Widespread civil disobedience, even if nonviolent, could undermine general respect for the law and for democratic processes.
Eroding the habit of obedience.
Potentially, yes. Lowering the fear of illegality, making people more likely to pick and choose which laws to follow based on personal preference.
And ultimately,
Ultimately, the fear is that it could threaten social order itself. If it becomes too common, it could slide towards general lawlessness, maybe even rebellion or revolution. It's a very fine line.
between principled protest and undermining the whole system.
Exactly. A very difficult and often dangerous line to walk. Outro.
Wow. We've certainly covered a lot of ground today, from just trying to define law to the ideals and problems of the rule of law and that really tangled web of law and morality.
Then looking at whether order comes from above or below, and how that connects to why we even punish people.
Right, those fundamentally different views of human nature reflected in retribution, deterrence, rehabilitation. And finally, grappling with justice itself, procedural versus substantive, and that really challenging idea of civil disobedience.
It does bring us right back to where we started, doesn't it? Those core questions. Law's potential to liberate versus its potential to oppress. That tension seems constant.
Yeah. And the search for order, whether we think it needs imposing or believe it can emerge naturally, that remains absolutely central for any society.
And Haywood's analysis really highlights that there aren't simple answers here. Just these ongoing, vital debates shaped by our deepest beliefs about people and society.
So after digging into all of this, what does it mean for you, listening? What responsibility do we have as citizens to constantly question whether our laws are truly just? And where do you draw that incredibly fine, maybe even blurry line between principled dissent and actions that could potentially unravel the social order we rely on?
It's definitely a provocative thought.
It is, and one that continues to challenge all of us.